energy as a mix has, I think, come down. So our vulnerability to oil prices is much lower. So every dollar per barrel is $1.7 to $1.8 billion a year. So if oil prices have fallen from 80 to 60, we have saved $35-36 billion a year, which is significant. It's like almost 1% of GDP. So, and if this was to go up, so if say 60 becomes 100, then this will reverse very sharp. So we are vulnerable, but less vulnerable than we used to be.
So historically, our balance of payment was anyway a little challenged because we had, the rupee kind of reacted much more sharply. It had to because of this, and that subsequently also played into domestic inflation and domestic growth.
So in fact, that brings us to a more strategic question, which is that if India has to become rich, has to become prosperous, it needs to control its sources of energy a lot more than it does right now.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Open Dialogue. Over the past many episodes, we've covered some very important macroeconomic variables, interest rates, exchange rates, and the like. Today, we'll focus on one more very critical element that goes into GDP growth, inflation, and many other criteria. Today, we'll speak about energy and how that impacts our economy and how we live our lives. To discuss this topic with me, I have Neelkanth Mishra. Neelkanth, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So Neelkanth, let's start with just this kind of what is energy and why is it so central to economic growth?
I think the best energy economist or the best known energy economist, Vaclav Smil, so he wrote this book, Energy and Civilization, where he says that almost everything that exists in human society today is linked to energy. To the extent that the size of a medieval town in Europe was dependent on the size of the forest around it. And once you go through that, you understand and appreciate how deeply embedded energy is for humans. So let's start with demand for cooking. The fact that, the chimpanzee or the gorilla, I mean, their intestines are much larger than ours, is because they eat raw food. And there is a certain limitation in how much you can process to feed brain. So the brain size development is also because brain consumes 25% of the bodily energy that we need. If you have to process that much energy in raw form, you need very large intestines, and there are constraints on that. So an integral part of human development was the development of fire and the ability to cook, because we kind of digest the food outside our body or half digest the food outside our body. That means that you need external sources of energy. In India, we don't have that much of an issue for a large part of the country, but in Europe, for a large part of the year, you need to have central heating. You also need energy to make materials. So if you are living in mud huts, the risk is that they don't last long. One bad rain and then just get washed away. You bake bricks and they last 5,000 years. So we are still finding the bricks that the Harappans baked. But that takes a lot of energy. So 5% of the energy consumed in India in the year 2017-18, where I last looked at the numbers, was used to bake bricks. 9% of the energy India consumed in that year was to make steel. So you think about food, you think about heating, you think about materials, you think about plastics that we use. It's all energy. So energy is very deeply embedded in human society. If you view it one way, the process of GDP growth, which is often about productivity, is also linked to energy. So if you walk from one point to the other, you will cover that distance, and when you do use a bicycle, it's still human power to travel faster. But to really travel faster, you have to use dense energy. And when you look at dense energy, it's also about energy density, in the sense that you can, in theory, run a car on straw. So the straw keeps burning, but you'll need so much straw that the car will move slowly and it will burn slowly, and there will be certain pace at which it releases energy. That's why crude oil is so powerful. That's why nuclear is so powerful. So GDP growth in many ways is, you think about any driver of productivity. So if you want to use robots to produce more stuff, you need electricity. You want to make things comfortable, like there's air conditioning going on, and so we can comfortably talk without getting distracted. In fact, there are studies that show that when the ambient temperature is high, human productivity drops. I mean, there are scientific studies that prove that. So, in order to improve productivity, to do temperature control, use lighting. It extends the day. All of this, almost all measures of productivity growth are linked to higher usage of energy. And now, you must have heard that, so far we have automated the act of doing. As we automate the act of thinking, one of the biggest constraints that is emerging for artificial intelligence and the deployment of AI is the availability of energy. So energy is absolutely deeply embedded in the process of human, in human life and in the process of economic growth.
Yeah, and if you think about the big inflection points there have been in the history of the human civilization, they are all linked around, or most of them are linked around, better sources of energy.
100%.
So fire, and then the industrial revolution, and then, kind of the electricity, agriculture, absolutely.
So agriculture is the first solar power plant, right? So you input 1 unit of energy and you get 2, 3, 4 units of energy because you're better able to capture sunlight. So 100%, very good.
So, Neelkanth, now kind of very helpful to understand. Let's focus a little bit on what exactly is energy and what are different types and so on and so forth. And subsequently, we'll get to the more, the macro factors of how does energy impact, what happens to prices, etc., etc. So first, let's just starting with various types of energy and what those are and where they go, where they come from, if you have some perspective.
So, and that's a very, I mean, the answer can be very long, but let me sort of compress it into, when you actually make what are called Sankey diagrams when you prepare, say, the energy input for a country, or you assess the energy input of a country. So, on the left, there will be like inputs. So, this is called the total primary energy supply. It's called TPES, where, so you could be using a lot of coal, but you and I, well, I have, because I grew up in Bokaro, but most people in Mumbai may not have even seen coal in their daily lives in a year or two, right? But coal is a very integral part of energy supply in India. So, so that's primary energy supply. And then there is how it is consumed. So the end form of consumption, where electricity is about, I mean, the last I saw it was 16, 17%, maybe it is 18, 19% now. So a reasonable part of energy is consumed in the form of electricity. A lot of energy, as I said, is consumed in the manufacture of materials. And extraordinarily large amount of energy is used for transportation. So there is industrial use, there is household use. In household use, there is stuff that we use, there's electricity, we use cooking gas, we use cars and motorcycles to move around, so we use petrol and diesel. These are effectively the end forms of energy. And now with electric vehicles and all that, we are starting to use electricity in transportation as well. A very large part of energy consumption is for industry, as I said, to make materials. So it takes a lot of material, like aluminum is considered like packaged electricity. It takes so much. It takes 15,000 kilowatt hours to make 1 ton of aluminum. Copper is very energy intensive. And as we increase the volumes that are needed, the easy part of materials extraction is becoming is done, and so the average copper concentration in the ore that is being extracted today is like 1%. So it takes more and more energy to get copper out of the copper ore that we get. So so the basic end use forms would be for humans, I mean for households would be electricity, petrol, diesel, cooking gas, which is either piped or in cylinders. Yeah, I guess that's it. And now when you make some of these things, so the inputs would be coal, gas, crude oil. These are for the world in 2024. They were, and these estimates vary, about 67, maybe 2/3 of total energy supply in the world came from coal, gas, and crude oil. Then you have nuclear, which is mostly used in the form of electricity. Then you have biogas, wood, and some of these residue. So these forms were like 25% of India's energy demand or energy supply.
Supply, hydro somewhere.
Yeah, and hydro as well. And of course, then the wind and solar, which again are the renewable energy, or sometimes geothermal, tidal. There are many new forms, but they are small in percentage.
Yeah, so the vast majority is coal, gas, and crude.
Yes.
And maybe hydro is the
Hydro has been flattish, so it's about, I would say, about 6-7% of world energy in terms of the TPES.
right.
In forms of end use, it may be higher, because what happens is when you convert coal into electricity, you lose 2/3 of the energy in the coal. There's a lot of loss in conversion. It is the same thing that happens when you use petrol or diesel in a car. A very small percentage, or say like lighting. The first bulb that Edison made, I've forgotten the percentage, but less than 1%. I think 0.1% of the energy that went into the filament was emitted as light. In 30 years, it had become, I think, 100 times better or 10 times better or something. So it improved dramatically. And of course, now LEDs are way more efficient in converting. So there's a lot of energy loss in conversion as well. So nuclear, hydel are very meaningful when you look at just electricity production. But in terms of end use, they are much smaller.
Understood. So vast majority is these three things, and then there are these newer areas that have newer forms of energy that have come up. So that's the other interesting aspect to get some perspective, Neelkanth, which is the sources of energy actually were very different, even maybe 20 years ago.
Yep.
And definitely 100 years ago, they were kind of very different, I guess. So if you can just talk about that change and what has happened and what's driven
So
it.
initially, as you can imagine, most of energy use was to make fire, and because there's no electricity. So till about 150 years back, there was no concept of electricity. There were no automobiles, so there was a train engine, and that's where industrial revolution really came. But before that, it was mostly about using animal power. So they were machines. In fact, there is one view of viewing the cow as a machine, that you input straw on one side and you get milk and manure on the other side. So similarly, horses. In fact, there is a fascinating view of how horses led to the spread of civilization, because this was one machine which could cross grasslands, because all of the grass was food, right? So this machine, you could ride through the day. At night, it could rest and then eat some of the grass that was available, and then so you could move around much faster. So other than that, so energy use was limited. So I think it's only about, I would say, 250, 300 years ago that we started to get into denser forms of energy. So I think charcoal had been discovered, as you know, just for clarification. So coal is what you dig out of the ground. Charcoal is what you make out of wood. So basically, you slow heat it, and so that all the volatile material gets out, and then you get very dense, pure forms of carbon. So people had been started using charcoal to do stuff like reducing iron and stuff like that. But otherwise, generally, it was just wood and crop residue and manures, cow dung cakes and stuff like that. The use of oil. So initially, when oil was discovered, well, oil was known to American Indians and in a lot of other societies for a while, but initial use of oil was for lighting. So it was actually for kerosene. And so it is when, it is quite interesting that when electricity came and people found that it was much more efficient than lighting, the prices of oil collapsed, because at that time there were no cars. It was when the car engine was manufactured that, again, that usage picked up. People then figured out that these engines could get were made much more efficient, much faster. There's a lot of innovation that went in. And over time, larger and larger engines started getting made. So some people say, read it in a book, that the transition of the British Navy from coal-based ships to oil-based ships in the First World War was a very integral part of their success against the German ships, which are still running on coal. Because if you use fuel which is higher density, your ships are lighter and move faster and more maneuverable and all that. So, so over a period of time, so you will see that the share of energy or the share of forms of energy. So, like you will see coal going up and then flattening out and then oil taking up, and most of these transitions take, I would say, 20 to 40 years. So, it is not something that happens very quickly, because as you can imagine, the form of energy is or the type of energy is very dependent on the form in which it is used. So, the transition from horses and cars happened very fast. Most of us have seen those pictures of what an American city looked like, say, 1907 and what it looked like in, say, 1920. Even that took like 13, 14 years, right? So, if you want to transition from a pure coal-based operation to pure oil-based operation, it takes different types of engines. The efficiency has to improve. Same with solar. So you start off with. So the question would be, why isn't solar adoption happening faster? Partly because in the early years of solar, which was, I think that it happened about 60, 70 years back, but the ability to capture was much lower. So the efficiencies, so we're currently at maybe 27, 28% efficiency, but initially it was much lower. So it's taken us a while. The cost of making an ingot, which is, I think it is 6 nines something. So there's a certain purity that you need for those silicon ingots. I know silicon grade, like the wafer grade, the semiconductor grade wafers are much more pure. But even to get to that level of purity and to get to that level of cost where you can get the silicon wafer so that the solar panel becomes efficient. So those technologies take many years to develop, and a lot of investment and losses and subsidies and all that. And then there's the issue of adoption. What also happens is that as you start using less of the older forms of energy, their price starts to fall, and that makes them even more attractive. So if you were benchmarking coal versus say solar with coal at, say, $120 a ton, if coal falls to $40 a ton, now solar needs to be 1/3 that price, and it's the same that is happening with oil. So if you're benchmarking at $100 a barrel versus now, say, at $60 a barrel, so now suddenly so that these transitions therefore take many years, right? Almost a generation.
Understood. And so hence what the point you make, which is the transition, and the transition has impact on many things. One transition that we've been talking about, and maybe it is happening, is replacing let's say crude and other forms of combustible forms of energy to the more environmentally safer forms of energy. So moving from ICE engines to EV, or moving to solar, or moving to wind, etc. So what's happening there, and where are we in the journey, and what are the big roadblocks?
So first we must say, I think it's important to remember that even these transitions, we need to look at the total energy consumed in the process. So just looking at what is the carbon emission once you already have a solar panel, and then saying that, what, an electric vehicle is much better, so you have to look at the total energy that goes into digging out the lithium, the nickel, the cobalt, the aluminium, like most EVs, because they're lighter, they use a lot of aluminium in the body. Aluminium is much more energy intensive than steel, which is heavier. Now, so when you look at total energy consumed through the life cycle, I'm not sure solar is that much cheaper or that much less carbon intensive than, say, current fossil fuels. Which is not to say that we shouldn't invest in them, but we need to be careful about overdoing it or accelerating the pace too fast, because there are many, I would say, unexpected changes and shifts that happen. So if you look at what has happened in Germany, for example, now they shut down the nuclear reactors. They then became overly dependent on Russian gas. And because of their belief that they would be the first to transition to solar and wind, the transition they did to that. Now suddenly the cost of energy has gone up, and the whole economy has become less competitive. So the price at which they make chemicals, the cost of living, everything goes up. You look at the blackouts that happened in Spain. I mean, it took 10 hours to bring the grid back because even the cycles that you needed to keep the grid stable, to get that up, you need a certain basic level of coal and gas based power, which they had done away with. So we have to be very careful in progressing towards that. And at the same time, I think it's important to remember that all of this carbon was actually dug deep into the ground, captured by nature and taken out of the carbon cycle through geological processes. And by digging them out of the ground and releasing them there, we are disrupting natural cycles. So that point is given. But people who have analyzed the total cost of an EV, they're finding that it's not yet crossed that carbon emission threshold also. Forget about energy efficiency, it's also about the carbon emission threshold. But as we plan for the energy future, and the good thing about India is, depending on who you ask, 70 to 80% of the infrastructure that we need in 2050 has not been built yet. So, we don't have to build an infrastructure around, say, diesel engines and petrol engines, and so we can instead build that infrastructure or coal-powered thermal power plants, and instead, rely a lot on renewable energy. So, but as we plan that, I think we need to be careful about not speeding up that process too fast. So as the transition happens, I think the natural signs are, first is that as the price curve falls, and more importantly, people gain familiarity with the technology, there are more and more people doing innovations, and therefore the transitions are faster. And as the price falls, the adoption of that technology it really takes off. So, like in the last, I would say, 8 years, 2016 to 24, there's been barely any change in, or barely any addition to thermal power capacity.
Right.
Whereas we have been adding, 5 to 12 gigawatts of solar power every year, and the expectation is that going forward, we should be adding 20-25 gigawatts of solar power plants, solar power capacity in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So I think we'll get there, but what is happening in Spain, what has happened in Germany, I think should give us caution that accelerating that process may actually be quite detrimental, because very few people understand how exactly this whole thing works.
Right. So the one kind of roadblock or one thing to think about is the total carbon footprint. There is also price, by the way, which is perhaps maybe a more important driver of adoption of these. How is that worked out for, let's say, either a solar or any other source of energy versus fossil?
Yeah, so this is where the things become so complex that it's very hard to find causal factors. So let's start with which is oil. Now, suppose you are Saudi Arabia or you're Iran or you're Russia. And so what happens is that you have several billion barrels of oil which are dug inside the ground. The cost of extracting, once you know where the oil is actually $5-6 a barrel, $10 a barrel. It's not too much. It's the cost of exploration, cost of digging the pipe, and some of them are like 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers inside. Some of them require horizontal drilling, which is really technically complex. Some of these are really fascinating technologies. If you know that in 10 years' time, oil is going to be less important and that the demand for oil has peaked and that it's only going to fall, it makes sense to take out the oil early, right? Because it's almost like there is stuff in the bank and if you don't take it out, its value will drop in 10 years, which then pulls forward the price decline, which means that coal and oil and gas are now much cheaper than they were expected to be, say, 5-7 years back. So now, again, the equation versus solar swings in favor of. So, for example, if you think about the number of kilometers that an electric vehicle has to run for it to be, lifetime cost break even versus an ICE car, an internal combustion engine car. The moment oil price falls to $60 a barrel, suddenly that number goes up by 67%, which is not going to again make sense. And unless you're bringing down battery prices a lot more, for that to happen, you're digging up a lot more lithium in like dangerous places and emitting. Same for solar. So currently, the fact that China has been so aggressive in dominating this industry, most of the solar ingot manufacturers, the solar cell manufacturers, so the process is that you take a silicon ingot, you slice it into wafers, you make cells out of it, then you pull them together into modules, and then you make panels out of it, right? So, so the cell and modules, so basically wafer cell module manufacturing, they put in so much money into it, and and to the production of those wafers and cells takes in so much energy, and all of that is coal powered. So unless you are a China, which has mastered the art of emitting a lot of carbon and moving a lot of coal from Inner Mongolia and then producing these, and then you have 90% market share, and anyone else who tries to make that. So India has been trying to build that ecosystem here, so that if we are going to add 25 gigawatts of solar power panel capacity, we should be able to make 25 gigawatts of solar panels every year. They always play some games, and then India is not able to build that capacity. Indian firms are not able to scale up. So, so there is that aspect as well, that the Chinese are investing so much capital in there that they have kind of made solar, I would say, excessively competitive, and I would say almost unviably competitive, meaning that if market forces were working, the solar panel prices would be much higher. And so then that begs the question that if they stop their subsidies, then is solar still viable? There are many such questions, but I think from the perspective of say the energy transition over the next 5-10 years, I think it's a reasonable assumption that I think the less carbon emitting technology. So for example, now nuclear is coming back into it's getting a lot of attention again, and this is because of new technologies that are coming up in small modular reactors, SMRs. So so far, nuclear was seen as more because the first thing that the humans did with nuclear was actually explode a bomb. So the peaceful use of nuclear, some of the accidents that happened in 3 Mile Island, Japan, Chernobyl. So this sort of disrupted, and in fact that's why Germany also, I think, they created problems for themselves. But now with small modular reactors, I think people are realizing that some of these can be contained. The disposal of the nuclear waste is a lot more manageable. And therefore, and with data center demand and data center power demand coming up in a big way, I think nuclear also as a mix, I think 10 years later will be quite competitive. So, and I think the good thing is that India and then with the US technology agreements, India also is likely to. In fact, that brings us to a more strategic question, which is that if India has to become rich, has to become prosperous, it needs to control its sources of energy a lot more than it does right now. And therefore, I think as we think about the next 5 to 10 years, the complexity of geopolitics, like today, the US, by dangling a carrot of, I will give you civil nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia, it is getting OPEC to increase supply even as demand is falling, which is why oil prices have gone from $80 to $60. Imagine that, they are able to dangle this and just disrupt the price of energy for everyone. So through this complexity, I think it's still important to remember that 10 years from now, the share of oil will be lower, the share of coal will be much lower, the share of nuclear will be higher, the share of wind and solar will be significantly higher than it is right now.
Understood. So Neelkanth, shifting tracks a little bit, energy is and particularly actually, and maybe the importance is going down, but historically, if you look at it, crude has been it's almost like a macroeconomic variable.
It is.
Right? I remember, it happens less now, but say 10 years back, 15 years back, actually the state of Indian economy was almost determined by what the crude price was.
Yeah.
And so it will be helpful to understand why that is the case, or why that was the case and what's maybe changing now.
So as we discussed, GDP growth and energy demand growth go side by side.
Yep.
Over a period of time, energy efficiency improves. So as I was explaining, the first light bulb was deeply inefficient.
Yep.
And the very fact that you could get some light out of it was an achievement. And over a period of time, that has improved. You look at car fuel efficiency. You look at the air conditioning efficiency. You look at refrigerators. So everything, or even the turbines and the boilers. How efficient they are in converting coal energy into electricity. So the efficiency keeps improving. So generally, if your GDP is growing at 7%, your energy demand will be growing at, say, 5.5%. So 1.5%, 2% is, this is how the world, at least the developed markets, their energy demand has flattened out. So they are growing at 2%, their energy efficiency is improving at 2%, so their total energy demand is kind of flattening out. It is economies like India and China which are growing faster. And so 1.5%, 2% is So if you want to grow at 7%, your demand is going to grow at 5%. And this will be dense energy demand. Because, 25, 30 years back, in China's energy mix, biofuel, or not, well, biofuel makes it sound very hot, but, crop residue and basically bio waste was a very meaningful, it was 25, 30%, 25% of their energy mix.
Right.
In India, till 15 years back, this was 30% of energy mix. But now with the cooking gas penetration improving, in the year 2011, nearly 2/3 of Indian households used primitive forms of fuel, cow dung cakes, crop residue to cook. Now that number is like 1/3 or maybe even lower. So that is part of the reason why more women are coming to the workforce. So energy is so deeply embedded in our society, right? So in a way, if your energy demand is growing at 5%, your dense energy demand is growing at 7 to 8%. You see what I'm saying? So because you have to use denser forms of energy, otherwise your productivity will not grow. Now, India does not have known sources of gas and oil, not enough. So 80, 85, 90% now of
We import basically.
we have to import. And that is why we are massively dependent. So if you think about our import mix, and this is a study I had done about 10 years back, I'm sure the ratios are more or less similar. And divide imports into stuff we don't have, stuff we can't make, and stuff where we are not competitive in terms of cost. almost 2/3 of the imports are stuff we don't have. So we don't have coking coal to make steel, we don't have oil, we don't have gas, we don't have uranium, we don't have gold, right? So these are the things that we import, and there's nothing you can do about it. And which is why there is a strategic vulnerability that if we have to grow and we need energy, and energy demand will grow, dense energy demand will grow even faster, and we don't have it. So till 91, maybe till say the year 2000, because we didn't have anything to export, and our exports were not very competitive, and the services industry was growing fast but was still small, we couldn't pay for it. So every time oil prices went up, we had a balance of payment crisis. Where would you get the dollars from? It is only when services exports started to grow. So if you remember 2007-8, when oil prices had hit $150,
Yep.
rupee was still appreciating because IT services exports were growing at 25%. So the dollar in-source was happening. So therefore, over the last 20-25 years, our vulnerability, and what has also happened is that, if oil in nominal prices was $150 a barrel, or say $100 a barrel in 2007-8, 150 was the peak, but say $200 on average, is today $60. So and imagine how much our services exports have grown, how much our goods exports have grown. So energy as a mix has, I think, come down. So our vulnerability to oil prices is much lower, but it's still there.
Yep.
Because we net import about 1.7 to 1.8 billion barrels a year, net import. So we have excess petrochemical and refining capacity. So we import more oil than we need, and then we export some petrochemicals. So every dollar per barrel is 1.7 to 1.8 billion dollars a year. So if oil prices have fallen from 80 to 60, we have saved 35-36 billion dollars a year, which is significant. It's like almost 1% of GDP. So and if this was to go up, so if say 60 becomes 100, then this will reverse very sharply. So we are vulnerable, but less vulnerable than we used to be.
Yeah. So historically, our balance of payment was anyway a little challenged because we were importing a lot and we were not exporting as much. And that import basket was, crude was a very large part of that import basket.
Correct.
And hence, if the price went up, it meant that we anyway had a balance of payment challenge. It also meant that the rupee kind of reacted much more sharply. It had to because of this, and that subsequently also played into domestic inflation and domestic growth. That equation has become better because our exports have gone up dramatically, and so now we don't have that much of. Actually, we don't have a balance of payment kind of an issue. The rupee doesn't also. I mean, it does react, but not.
We have enough reserves to keep it in control. So control the volatility.
Absolutely, and so that's a little bit what has changed. So linked to this, I mean, kind of we covered this very briefly. The price of crude is a major determinant of inflation. Again, will be helpful to understand why that happens. And this, by the way, is not just the case for India. It is for almost all economies.
So and whether it should be or not comes later. But even in the US, there is this fascinating study that what drives inflation expectations. So as we've discussed in our prior episodes about monetary policy, interest rate setting, that inflation is most harmful when it resets inflation expectations, because when they are reset, then you need a slowdown in the economy to bring down inflation. Now, in India, in large parts of India, onion prices set inflation expectation. Maybe it is because it's an essential part of all cooking in India. In the US, it is prices at the pump, fuel price, which sets the inflation expectation. So, you're right that oil prices have a very significant impact on inflation. One channel is through inflation expectations, because people are so used to buying it on a daily basis, and this is a price they can track on a daily basis because they buy it frequently, and so it has a very big influence on psychology. But if you take a much deeper route, so this is more make-believe, maybe at some point this will switch, because the price of fuel in the consumer baskets is shrinking, because electric vehicles are becoming much more important, and as we discussed, oil prices in nominal terms haven't changed really in 20 years.
Yep.
So, in real terms, they've fallen. So, they're becoming less important, but they're still important. And if you think about inflation at the very core, it is nothing but the price of labor and the price of energy. Because if you take any good, so say take a chair, or a car, whatever, right? So car is nothing but a lot of steel and aluminum going through various types of processes. A lot of tires, which is again oil, the rubber, it's vulcanized and artificial rubber. Cables, which require copper and aluminum, and that again tends to energy. So when you really go down to the grassroots, it is about labor, so wages, and price of energy. And because energy, while the usage where coal is used cannot be, you cannot switch from coal to oil everywhere. Like in a blast furnace, if you have to use coking coal, you have to use coking coal. You can't use oil. I mean, you have to convert into calcined coke or something and then start dumping it, which actually is very inefficient. So, but most energy uses at margins are fungible. So what tends to happen is that if that 15-20% of palm oil is used for biofuel blending, a lot of corn is used to make biofuel and used for fuel blending. And countries like Indonesia and Brazil, which are very rich in say like palm oil for Indonesia and corn and other products for Brazil, they change their blending basis the crude oil price and the palm oil price. So if say crude oil prices fall, then they reduce the blending, and then that brings down the edible oil price also. Same with corn. So there is a lot of fungibility in say on this front. Gas and oil are fungible for petrochemicals. So there are certain petrochemicals that you can make using gas, there are certain you can make using oil also. So in power generation, gas and coal are fungible. So when oil prices fall, a lot of others, the whole energy sort of ecosystem sort of deflates. So which is why I think oil prices are a very important driver of inflation over a period of time. This doesn't happen immediately, but as I explained, at the grassroots level, it is wages plus energy which drives inflation. It takes time for that transmission to happen. So suppose if oil has gone from 80 to 60 and it stays there, or as people are now saying, it's going to go to 50 also, and it stays there, then you could see 1 or 2 years of very low inflation, because the whole of the ecosystem then comes down.
Yeah. So it's very important point you made, Neelkanth, which is that oil itself maybe let's say X% of the consumer basket, but actually the rest of the consumer basket is also a very kind of a derivative of the oil price.
Exactly.
Because as you said, at the end of the day, everything is labor and oil, labor and energy. So as an example, you made the point that if you to build this chair, some energy has to go into building this chair.
Yeah.
So the price of the chair itself will go up because crude prices are going up.
And basic things like food, because fertilizer,
Yeah.
if you only use sunlight, there is a certain yield you get.
Yes.
Unless you use fertilizer, the yield is not going to go up.
Correct.
And fertilizer is nothing but
A direct derivative of
Yes.
crude prices. Transportation is the other one. Like, onions maybe rupees 10 somewhere, but for it to come to Mumbai, you need to kind of, there's a trucking price. So, it becomes 12 by the time it is here, and the price of crude goes up, it'll go up even further.
Yeah.
So it's very intricately involved in pricing, and hence it also, somewhere sets inflation expectations
Yes.
as well. It's again a very kind of fascinating concept. Now, Neelkanth, you mentioned this that in 2007 the price of oil was $150 at one point in time, but let's say 120. It has gone down. At one point in time, it went down, like during COVID, it went down dramatically. Then it came back. Then the wars happened. It again went up, but they didn't go up much actually. One of the surprises during the Ukraine war was that the price of crude didn't actually go up as much as people thought it would. Now it is at $60, and you are saying it may even fall down to 50. So in 20 years, the price of crude has been very volatile, but actually it has gone down. So what's happening? Like, what drives this, and what drives the price of?
This is where capitalism is fascinating. So the biggest delta in oil supplies has come from the US.
Yep.
So, the oil shock of the 70s was, okay, so if you take a step back and see how oil really developed. It's a fascinating story of how the biggest oil field in Saudi Arabia was discovered. I mean, there was someone sort of mapping it and then found this bulge and was trying to understand why this is there, and they found the biggest oil field in the world, and still. And but the Saudis did not have the technology to develop it. So a lot of the development, and in fact, the very fact that the British and the Americans supported Saudi Arabia was because they wanted that oil. And a lot of global geopolitics is about energy. So around the 70s, when most of West Asia said that, so till then, it was global oil majors which were working because the countries of West Asia did not have the technology to drill and extract oil and process it and all that. So foreign firms, US firms mostly, British firms were, Canadian or French firms and all that were operating these fields. So the first oil shock was when these countries said, you know what, we are nationalizing this. And now we will, so there's OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and then we become a cartel. And because the whole world needs it and we control 30-40% of the supply, so we are going to set the price now. So there was a significant increase in oil prices. And over a period of time, so then Russia became, 30 years later, OPEC Plus. So Russia also joined so that they would get better bargaining power. Now, the US has been the disruptor.
Right.
So, so part of the change that happened after 2007 was when, and this is where capitalism works, that, if you give a very high price, you create incentives for people to inject capital and to innovate. And so new forms like shale, so earlier it was impossible. There was no technology to extract. So people knew there was oil, there was gas, but it was impossible to extract it. So the high oil prices, high gas prices triggered the capital investment that was needed. And once the technology is built, it can be deployed any number of times. So that threshold, and so the fact that US is now exporting 4.5 million barrels a day is absolutely incredible. So this didn't just add significantly to supply, it also broke the cartel or broke the power of the cartel. And therefore, whatever was the surplus, so it is generally when you price commodities, especially when there is no cartel, you do a cost plus analysis. So you do a cost curve that, 30% can produce aluminum at $1,200, but the last 20% are doing it at $2,400, and therefore aluminum cannot fall below $2,400. It's a very simplistic but practical way to model it. If you have a cartel, that doesn't work. So because they will say, no, I need at least this much. So if Saudi Arabia's budget balances at $80, it's very likely that they will be stuck at 80 for a long time because they'll try to control it that way.
Even though their cost of production is maybe 25.
Yes, it's actually $5 or $10.
Yeah.
So they make a lot of money on oil. Now, and then the whole ecosystem settles around that.
Yep.
So there's a lot of wastage. So till the time that Iran got the sanctions, there was no concept of switching off fans in Iran because the energy was so cheap that they would waste it. So anyway, so coming back to this, so what has happened after 2007 was that, this whole new shale gas and shale oil industry came up. A lot of new reserves were therefore became practical to extract. And one of the things that happens in oil is that once you set up the pipe and the pressure of the oil itself sort of starts guzzling up, it's very hard to stop it. So, so if there is supply, there is supply. Now, if you don't reinvest, so it is quite possible that if so currently there is a oil demand problem as well, but if oil demand remains weak and maybe there is no need to dig fresh wells, there is a certain amount of capex that you need to do to develop fresh wells. But once the well exists, it's very hard to cap it, because once you cap it, then it's very hard to extract it again. So part of the reason that during the Russian war or the Russia-Ukraine war, oil prices didn't fall is that some of those fields started supplying, China, India. So it was actually in the interest of the world also that the Russian oil kept getting used, because if you completely blocked it in order to hurt the Russians, oil prices globally would have gone up a lot.
Correct.
And that would have hurt the Americans and everyone, Germans and everyone else as well. So why they kept shouting that, oh, why is India and China buying Russian oil? But they didn't really try too hard to stop it. And so going forward as well, I mean, these are very complex commodities to model, but there is a certain amount of reinvestment that is needed to keep the oil fields and oil gushing at this level. But in the near term, I would say a $50-60 thing seems reasonable, because there's a lot of uncertainty. Global growth is weak. There is a transition happening to electric vehicles, which is not as fast as people had thought, but it is still happening. And I think most importantly, the US is now increasing drilling again. So when JD Vance says drill baby drill, that a lot of the environmental constraints, the regulatory cholesterol that they had built up around energy exploration is being removed. So they are maybe bad for the earth and for the environment over a 30-40 year period. But in the near term, they are saying that, look, it is important for the US to have cheap energy. And as we have discussed, a lot of the innovation really happens when energy is cheap, because that's when you automate, you use robots, you use machines, and you're not scared of wasting energy because the price is so low. And that's when real strong innovation starts to happen. So new uses are discovered, new chemicals are discovered and all that. So they are thinking that, look, an integral part of US growth is cheap energy, and so we are going to keep energy prices low by incentivizing the Saudis to influence OPEC to keep pumping more oil, and dangling that civil nuclear agreement. So I think all of that should keep energy prices low. And the reason I'm narrating all of these variables is that all of them go into setting up the price of energy.
Right. And actually, oil is from a like a demand supply perspective, it's a great commodity which creates a great use case. So, the marginal cost for Saudi, as you said, to make oil is maybe $5-10. For the US shale, maybe it is much higher. So if the price is at 90 or 100, it incentivizes people to dig new wells in the US, in Texas or wherever it is, and that brings in more supply, which should then bring the price down. And if the price is at $50 or $40 or $60, then maybe some of them become unviable and then they go out of business. And so then again, supply then matches the demand. And
and let me add a bit of complexity to that. Let me add currency as a complexity to that. So the fact that Saudi Arabia, I mean, depending on what price you take, exports or produces about $400 to $500 billion of oil, and most of it is surplus because it's a small country, very few people. It generates a lot of current account surplus. Now, the US allows them, through an agreement signed in the 70s, to keep buying US treasuries to keep the currency pegged to the dollar. Now, and so if you look at, say, Norway or in Australia and other big energy producers, if they have significant surpluses, what it does is their currencies start to appreciate. So, the ones that are not pegged to the dollar. And that pushes up the cost curve in dollar terms.
Correct.
Now, in the next, say, 10 years or next, say, 5 years, what will be fascinating will be, as the US dollar falls, as we've discussed in the previous episode, that the likelihood that the real effective exchange rate is too high and therefore can fall by 20-25%, maybe 30-35%. What does it do to the cost curve of oil production? So will the Saudis be also asked to sort of revalue against the dollar, or will they be sort of left exempt because they are allowing OPEC to produce more? But if the Aussie dollar or the the euro or other oil producers see currencies appreciate against the dollar, so then will the oil cost curve go up? And which, as you were saying, if the marginal producer goes to say $40, then $10 as a margin is not enough for them to be drilling new wells, because some of these new technologies, the each well does not have a very long life. It's not like you dig a well and you relax for 20 years. You have to keep digging new wells. So that investment will be needed. But most importantly, if today the US is exporting 4.5 billion barrels, the dollar becomes really cheap, then maybe the US produces even more, because the US becomes much more cost competitive versus. So it will be fascinating to see how the energy mix changes.
Great. One final point, Neelkanth, which is in the face of all of this volatility, the price in India at the pump has broadly remained,
In Mumbai, 103 rupees.
103 to 110 rupees.
So that's kind of 100.
Yeah, whatever, 103, 104. In that ballpark, right? It's maybe gone up 1 or 2 rupees here and there. So what's happening?
So see, the price at the pump is, so if crude oil plus refining margins. So crude oil cannot be used, right? So you have to first refine it. So you have that distillery where various segments get broken. In some cases, of course, petrochemicals are other petrochemical margin, but in this case, refining itself produces diesel and petrol and a certain mix. Then there is a marketing margin, because it takes some energy and cost to move it from where it is refined to where it is in the pump. You need to pay the guy at the pump and all of that. So there's a marketing margin, but there is a lot of excise. So the government taxes it. Now, when it was set up as a tax initially, the excise duty, which actually is not shared with states, it's actually purely central revenue. On top of that, there is value-added tax at the state level. So the center charges excise, the state charge sales tax. So this gets added. Now, when it was set up, it was because petrol was the consumption of the rich. So even till 2000, ownership of a motorcycle was a sign of prosperity.
Correct.
So so the government's thinking behind it was that, look, these are the rich people, so let's tax them. And today it is also viewed as a price of energy transition, in the sense that we don't have oil, we don't have petrol, diesel and all that. So we should incentivize other forms of energy. So if we keep petrol, diesel at a certain price, the usage will not grow beyond a certain level. And therefore, as an economy, we will start to use, incrementally have less petrol and diesel usage, because we are so import dependent on them. So the another factor here is that if oil prices are very volatile, see what tends to happen is, if you allow, say petrol price to fall by 20 rupees a liter, which in theory perhaps you can, what can happen is then the demand for it rises very rapidly. And say 6 months, 9 months later, if oil prices go back to 100, then you are, then as a country, your import bill just really explodes. And the economy goes through a lot of volatility. Because as we said, as we discussed, energy is a very integral part of economic growth. So trying to keep prices stable is therefore, I think, from an economic stability perspective, also important. Now, I'm not sure all of these deep thoughts are going into it. I think at the face of it, I think it's much easier politically, because when prices go down, no one notices. When prices go up, it becomes a huge problem for everyone. So from the government's perspective, keeping it stable, so long as it is not slowing down GDP growth, is wise. And if the marketing margins for, remember that most of the oil marketing companies are government owned. So periodically, if say oil stays at 60, then maybe they'll increase the excise duty and extract more out of it. So that's the reason. And I think it is the desire to generate some revenue out of it, desire to, but that's I think a secondary reason. The primary is to reduce economic volatility. And an equally important factor is to reduce the political risk of, because fuel prices are very politically sensitive.
Absolutely. So basically the intent is to say, look, you don't worry. For you, the price is 103 rupees. If the crude falls, then the government makes a little bit more money.
Yes.
If the crude goes up, then the government maybe makes less money and it uses the money that it was it's made earlier to fund this kind of phase where the price has gone up. So for the consumer, there is some stability, and that's kind of the thinking here. We had fascinating conversation with Neelkanth. We kind of went very broad here. We started with why energy is so critical. We spoke about how actually human development is linked to energy, and some of the most pivotal moments in inflection points in human history have been linked to the discovery of better forms of energy. We spoke about various types of energy, both the sources as well as the users, and where we spoke about how even today, 2/3 of the sources of energy are fossil fuel linked kind of sources. This is obviously changing, but even now 2/3 of the energy are of that nature. Uh, Energy we discussed is critical and central to economic growth because, as you mentioned, every unit of incremental GDP comes from better usage or higher usage of some kind of energy source, and everything finally is a combination of labor and energy in different shapes and forms. And so energy is very central to growth. We also spoke about how for countries to become rich, they need to have their own sources of energy, which is why also perhaps India is also taking this very seriously and investing a lot in various types of energy. Uh, Energy and particularly crude is central to inflation. While the fuel basket may itself not be very large, but almost everything is derived, is a derivative of the fuel price, and hence fluctuation in fuel prices impact inflation a lot. And so from that perspective also it's a very critical macro variable. And we spoke about what's happened to the crude price. It was actually, if you think of it, it is secularly declining with volatility obviously, but it's a declining trend because of various things, transition of energy to newer forms, uh, improvement in efficiencies which result in lower usage of energy itself, as well as newer supply coming in, which has kind of made the cartel a little bit less effective and brought in more supply. And so also, given where we are, looks like energy prices will be around this level or maybe even lower than where it
in the
was.
near term. And while you were summarizing, I just to add another aspect which we didn't discuss, but I think is very important, is the aspect of energy efficiency.
Right.
So just for perspective, per unit of energy consumed, Japan generates 4 times as much GDP as India does.
Right.
I'm talking in nominal terms, maybe in PPP terms, the purchasing power parity terms, it will be smaller, but they are incredibly energy efficient. And this transition actually happened in the 70s when energy prices went up, and Japan also, like India, does not have any dense forms of energy. So they're forced to be very energy intensive, and that drove a lot of innovation. And India, given that we lack energy, dense forms of energy in the economy, we also need to continuously focus on energy efficiency. And a very integral part of energy efficiency is energy pricing.
Right.
So just like we discussed that petrol price has been stuck at 110 rupees a liter, the fact that we are terrible at pricing electricity is something that we need to sort out if we need to think about the next 20 years, because we overly subsidize some forms of electricity consumption and then ask the industry to pay a very high price of energy for electricity. So we have among the lowest price of electricity from a household perspective and the highest prices of electricity at an industry level. And one of the questions I often ask when I'm asked to present to people in the government is it better to give free power to people or to give them a job so that they can pay for it themselves? So if you reduce industry prices, our industry becomes more competitive, there are more jobs, and then more people get the income so that they can pay for it. There are some forms where you need to subsidize, but I think the right pricing of energy is going to be very critical when we're thinking about energy efficiency.
Super. Fantastic, Neeraj. Thanks a lot, Neelkanth, sorry, for that conversation. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Yeah, I did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening into this episode of Open Dialogue. I hope you enjoyed this as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. We are overwhelmed by the response that we've received and really look forward to your comments and feedback. Do like and subscribe to our channel to keep track of new episodes that are coming through. Thank you.